Lessons and Stories, and I'm Ron Cross. I hope that this episode finds you well in practicing good, safe, of course, social distancing. We're in a very unique environment, and everybody is in it together. And as long as we all do the right thing, I think everything will eventually be okay. Well, enough of that. What's today's topic? Well, today's topic is going to be about the 7 things to do to improve your public speaking. And I think this is perhaps a critical topic for early career and mid-career types, because if you can't communicate well or can't communicate in large or small crowds and be comfortable in doing that, that will impede your progress in the development of your career. So these 7 things, if you pay attention to them and you work at improving in these areas, I do believe will help you. Now, what are these 7 things? Well, before we go there, if you do me a small favor, I would greatly appreciate it. If you would like, subscribe, and share my content with others, that would be very helpful as I endeavor to grow this YouTube channel. Okay, so what are the top 7 things? Let's just go through them one at a time. Number 1, you need to know the material that you're presenting, and you need to practice, practice, practice. You never fake it. So know your material, practice in delivering that material, anticipate the questions that could be asked about the material, and of course, work through some of the answers. Now, you're never going to be able to anticipate all the possible questions that could be asked about the material, or even things that are asked of you that are not related to the material at all. And it does happen in meetings. You don't have control of the audience. Literally, the audience is in control. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. So here's one caution that I perhaps mentioned just a moment ago. You never fake it. So what does that mean in terms of knowing the material? Well, if somebody asks you a question that requires a greater in-depth knowledge than perhaps you are knowledgeable of or know about, you don't give them an off-the-cuff answer that perhaps is right or maybe could be wrong or not well thought out. Now, we're going to recommend something that is number 6 later on. So I'm going to reserve that number 6 until we get to it. That will help you in this area. But the bottom line is, know your material as inside and out. Make sure that you're comfortable in delivering it by practicing, practicing, practicing it, and you never fake it. Never go off the cuff. Always think through it. And you can even ask clarifying questions of the individual in the audience who perhaps asked that difficult question. Now, as long as you never fake it and you give an honest answer, or you even say to the individual or individuals that have asked the question, well, I'm not prepared to answer that because I haven't given that in any great detailed thought. If we could have a sidebar, a side discussion at the first break, then perhaps I can further get some clarification on what it is you're asking. And that's okay to say something like that. People will know that you're being considerate of them as an audience, and you're not going to be flippant and giving an answer that's not well thought out, or perhaps you have no standing in answering that question. By the way, it is okay if there is a colleague to throw the question over to the colleague. And again, we're going to come back to that point later in this top 7 steps to improve your public speaking. What's number 2? The number 2 is perhaps as important as anything in here. Be yourself. Do not be so wooden in your communication that it is difficult for people to follow you, or perhaps even to hold their attention. Because if you talk in a monotone, you'll never get their attention and perhaps never accomplish whatever goals you've set for the meeting. I can give you a story. Back in my undergraduate days, we had a professor who was teaching Western Civ. Now, this professor taught classes, large classes. We're talking about in excess of 100. But the class was held at the most inopportune time during the day. It was held right after lunch at 1 o'clock. And everybody had eaten lunch, and we all know that the blood rushes from the brain and goes to the stomach to help with the digestion, or that's my understanding, right? So everybody gets a little sleepy and they tend to want to take a nap or a short rest. Well, as the story goes, and I was in this class and I saw it firsthand, many of the students began to nod off while the good professor was lecturing about the content and the material. And of course, she's sitting looking at everybody in the class, and she knows as a public speaker, she does not have everybody's attention. Now, there's a difference between being a professor in a class and a captive audience, so to speak, and some of the things that professors can do, and some of the things that you cannot do speaking in public as maybe a representative of the team, a representative of the company, or maybe in a volunteer type organization where you're doing something that is charitable. There are some limitations placed upon you as a professional. But what she did is she took the Western Civ book, that textbook was about that thick and about that large, and she held it in both hands, level out over her head, and she just released it. Now, this hall had concrete floors, and when the textbook hit the floor, it sounded like a cannon going off in the room. And I cannot tell you the number of people that leaped out of deep sleep, out of their chairs, and immediately, without any thought, the survival mode must have kicked in. They bolted for the door. Now, that was in about 1975. You couldn't do that today, given all that has happened and transpired since 1975. But she knew that she didn't have the attention of the audience. So if you, in your delivery mode, you delivered the talk in a monotone, and she did, it's kind of like the drone of a fan people put on at night to help them sleep. People began nodding off. If you speak in that manner, you're never going to hold the attention of your audience. So it's very, very important to be yourself. As a matter of fact, I had a young early career, actually they were a new college hire potential that were interviewing. They were interviewing for a job we had at the place of employment that I worked at in around 1985. And this individual came in, and technically they were very good. They had answers to the technical questions, but they were so nervous that their voice quivered and they were interrupted by their own nervousness in order to not fluently complete the thought, right? So it was an involuntary thing that they were just simply nervous. And clearly, to me, this individual was worth hiring, but I knew that this individual, given the nature of our business, was going to need to improve in their public speaking, one-on-one, in teams, and in front of perhaps a customer at some later date. So on the first day when the individual was brought in as a full-time employee, I set them aside and I said, look, you know, you're technically very good, but you're going to need to improve your public speaking. You're going to need to get over your nervousness. I would suggest something that will help you be yourself when you speak, and you can speak confidently. I would suggest that you go join an organization like Toastmasters. Now, I'm not a member of Toastmasters, but I knew that we had a local chapter on our business campus that was there simply to help individuals, professional early career types, to improve their public speaking. And so, you know, he took it to heart. And within 6 to 9 months, he was very smooth at delivering a presentation to the team and to our management. So he practiced. He got involved with external organizations. He learned how to be comfortable enough about himself and what he knew that he could deliver his talk in such a way that was relatable to the audience. Okay? And really, that leads us into number 3. You need to be able to read your audience. The audience is perhaps the single most thing in the presentation besides the message, right? If you lose the audience, you will not accomplish in delivering the message and accomplish any of the goals that you had for that gathering, whether it's a one-on-one meeting, a team meeting, or perhaps it's a design review or a meeting with your customer or some external organization. So how can you learn to read your audience? In one of my classes I took in my after I graduated, it was a graduate class. The professor recommended that we get a book entitled Body Talk, Body Language and read it. And he actually lectured from much of the content in that book. Now, any book along those lines that's done by an academic study, we're not talking about a book that will allow you to better relate to your wife or better relate to your girlfriend, boyfriend, or husband, or whatever the case is. We're talking about a book that studies the culture of how people communicate and the things that are most effective in allowing people to get the message across, and how you can read your audience to determine whether or not they're receptive, or they're in a defensive mode, or they're not interested whatsoever. One of the things that the author of the book stated was that the flight response is in the extremities. And what he said was that if there is any movement, like tapping of fingers, tapping of feet, in the extremities, then the people are wanting to be someplace else besides there. And now you can do one of two things. You can adjust how you're speaking to the audience. You can ask a direct question of the individual and try to bring them at ease. Or you can even say, oh, it looks like you have a question. Is there something on your mind that you would like to ask me? So you're actually reading the audience, and then you're doing number 4. You're engaging the audience in a very respectful way. Now, going back to number 3, in terms of reading your audience, if the individuals sit with their arms crossed and their legs crossed, that is a defensive posture. In other words, they're not really on your side. They're holding judgment, and they might even be a little more in opposition to you because you're obviously saying some things that are uncomfortable to them. This is a defensive posture, and crossing the legs and arms is a defensive posture. But as I'm doing right now, I'm leaning forward. You have all my attention. I'm looking at you. Wherever you move on the stage, if you're on a stage, I'm following you. That forward leaning means you've got their interest. So learning how to read the audience is as important in delivering an effective presentation or speech as anything else is. And also, if a person is in a defensive posture, you will know that when they ask a question, perhaps there's something more that they're intending. And you can take that bit of information in and use that in deciding how to respond or to answer them. And sometimes if they answer a question that is clearly hostile to your message, you can say to them something to the effect, look, I understand where you're headed with that. That's not the intent of this meeting, but perhaps let's get together after the meeting. I would love to talk to you further about this question, about your concerns. You can use some deflection, but not putting them off entirely, because you're making the commitment to get with them after the meeting or the presentation. So being able to read the audience, whether they're with you, against you, or kind of indifferent, they're bored, will help you do some things as you engage the audience, which is number 4. You engage the audience in a very respectful way to make sure that you're bringing them along on the journey. If you lose them early, you're not going to accomplish the intent of the meeting. They're not going to come to the understanding that you desire to convey to them. And they're not going to be, especially if they're decision makers, they're not going to be in support of what it is you're trying to do. So being able to engage the audience in a very respectful way as a whole or as an individual member of the audience is so very, very important. One of the things that I do in the classroom and informal meetings, if I'm standing in center stage and somebody over here on the wing asks the question, I will leave center stage and go over and face them directly and approach them and let them know they are important to me. The audience has to understand that they are important to you, and that even if they're not asking legitimate questions, you have to address them in a very respectful way. And if you see somebody wanting to ask a question by reading their body talk, you can look at them and say, it looks like you have a question on your mind the way you're looking. do you have a question for me? Please share it with us. I'm more than willing to address it. And if I can't find the answer to it immediately with the material I have in front of us or with one of my colleagues, we will certainly be happy to address your question after the meeting. But why don't you let us know what's on your mind today? And you see, you're treating them with dignity and respect. You're encouraging them to engage with you in the presentation, because it's a give and take sort of thing that you're doing. Unless you're giving the Nobel Prize acceptance speech where there's no response expected from the audience, you're just giving them your acceptance speech. Most generally, when you're doing a presentation in business or in academia, you're expecting the audience to engage with you and perhaps even interrupt you in a very respectful way from time to time to ask the question or make a statement of support or opposition. And don't be offended if it's a statement of opposition. It does happen, and that's just the way life is. Not everybody is going to see the facts the way you see them or see the things the way you see them. So the purpose of the meeting is to accomplish some goal. You cannot accomplish the goal unless you engage the audience respectfully. Now, perhaps another important thing to understand to do when you deliver your message, you want to do it in a way that you're telling a story. And that will really help with number 2, being yourself. It's easier to tell a story than to rattle off a bunch of facts and try to connect complicated thoughts together to convey meaning. People are inclined, and maybe it's just the way we're raised, maybe it's our culture, not sure, maybe it erupts from something a little more primal. They're more interested in hearing a story that will allow them to gain understanding. Now, I'm not telling you to fabricate some hypothetical story and there's a plot and so forth. I'm telling you to actually convey to them what it is you need to convey by relating a storyline that supports the objectives of your talk. And it's not fabricated, it's based in fact, and you're leading them down the garden path to that destination where you all want to arrive together. And if you do that, then you've accomplished the goals of your meeting. Okay? Now, I mentioned number 6. While you're telling the story, if questions come up, have your backup material available so that you can quickly go through it. If it's a PowerPoint presentation, you can jump to it fairly quickly. Or if it's a question that is germane to your talk, but you don't have the background to answer it, you always want to have your subject matter experts who are on your team, your colleagues in the room, so that you can say, hey, Sally, I know that's your area of expertise. Perhaps you might want to address that. Or VJ, this is more important in your area. I think you could probably do a better job in answering that for this gentleman here. See, you can actually call out members of your team who have the background and the knowledge and the ability to convey the message in terms of the question that was asked, okay, the answer. So if you arrive at the meeting and you're prepared to give it, you want to make sure that you have the backup material available that you can pull up instantaneously. Or if it's a question that is beyond your reach, you throw it over to your subject matter experts, your SMEs, the gurus and SMEs on your team, and they should readily be able to handle it. And of course, if it's one of those arcane type questions that begs a tangent to be discussed, you can always put full stop on it and say, that is really an interesting point you're making, but I think it's best to discuss it in a sidebar. The objective of this meeting is to do such and such. So don't let them use these arcane questions to get you and the meeting off track. Otherwise, you're never going to add value in the meeting, and the meeting is not going to accomplish its objectives. Okay? Now, last, number 7, is really a hot button on my part. And when I've given a formal presentation where I've been given 15 minutes to give a presentation, or 20 minutes, or 10 minutes, and I'm one of many in the meeting giving their presentations, it really is my hot button when other people are not respectful of the time. If you're given 10 minutes, stick to the 10 minutes. Make sure that you've developed your presentation in such a way that you can deliver it in 10 minutes. and anticipate questions. If it's 15 minutes, endeavor to stick to 15 minutes. If somebody asks a question that's going to throw you outside your time domain, look at the organizer of the meeting and ask them if it's okay if you go a little longer in answering this question. Here's the problem. I have been last on some meetings where I'm giving a presentation, and that means my presentation probably didn't start until about 4:30. The meeting was going to be over at 5, and everybody else took 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 10 minutes longer. And now I'm right up at the stops of 5 o'clock to give my presentation. It serves no one any good to rush through a presentation because nobody's listening. Everybody's gathering their bags. They're rushing off to take a cab or catch a plane so that they can get back home or back to their work area. So be respectful. Start and finish on time. Be respectful of the other colleagues and associates that may be presenting in the symposium or wherever you're giving that presentation. Stick to the time. And if you can't, ask the organizer if you can take a few more minutes as you endeavor to wrap things up. And if you do this, you're going to be an exceptional speaker, whether it's a one-on-one, whether it's in a team meeting, whether it's in a formal presentation where you're actually standing up in front of a large audience. You will increase your effectiveness. People will give you respect, and they will perceive you as one of the authorities in that subject matter area because you're able to accomplish the means and the objectives of the meeting. And that's going to be meaningful to the higher ups, the people that have some control over your career. And with that, my friends, I wish you all the best. Until the next episode, you take care and be safe. You know you're always on my mind.